Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So as we have been doing on Vaisakha evenings, I've picked out one of the Jatakas to relate the stories of the Buddha's previous lives. And the structure of the Jatakas follows a formula. There's always they call the story of the present, a short anecdote, and then the Buddha says, oh, it's something similar happened long ago, and then he tells the Jataka, then he identifies the birth, who's who in the story, and they are. The story of the present was a man, this particular Jataka is called the footprint Jataka. There was a man who had a son who was very skilled in the art of following footprints, like tracking. And the father was very proud of his son and his skill, and he wanted to challenge the son one day, test him to see how good he was. And he snuck out of the house and went for a long, rambling walk through the town, ending up at the Jataka monastery to see the Buddha. And the son asked his mother, "Where did father go?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe you could follow him." And so he follows the father's footsteps round about the circular route, winding in and out of the town, and ends up at the Jataka monastery. And the father says proudly to the Buddha, "This is my son. He's got the skill of tracking. He can follow footsteps very well." And the Buddha says, "Oh, that's not so remarkable. There was long ago there was a man who could follow footsteps that were laid down even 7 years ago, and even through the air." Then he tells the story of the past. It seems in the town of Varanasi there was a married couple, and the wife was discontented, and she took a lover, and the husband heard wind of it. He found out about it, and he challenged her, and she said, "No, I haven't cheated on you. It's a lie they're spreading about. If I've done such a thing, may I be reborn as a horse-headed yaka." So when time came for her to die, she was reborn as a yaka with the head of a horse. And as yakas are subject to Vesawana, the king of the north, one of the four great kings, and they typically have to serve him for a period of time, such as 7 years, and he works them very hard. Sometimes they actually die in his service from overwork. He sends them often to fetch him anotata water from the Himalaya. It's a long, arduous journey, and then they come back carting a big jug of water. And as soon as they get back, he sends them again. But this particular yaka was hardy, and she survived her 7 years of service, so as her reward, she was given a territory. And this is typical of yakas that, although they're brutish, horrid, monstrous things that kill and eat people, they have a strange propensity to be very law-abiding. They follow the rules laid down by Vesawana. He said, "Here is your territory. From this river to these hills to this forest to those hills in the south, a certain territory of so many square yojanas. This is your territory. Anyone who wanders into this territory, you are free to kill and eat them." So she set herself up in a cave in this land, and from time to time, merchant caravans would cross through the land, and she would attack them and kill them and tear them apart and eat them. One time, a Brahmin was traveling with this caravan, and she carried him back to her cave, intending to eat him, but He was so charming and pleasing of looks that she fell in love with him, and she decided to, instead of eating him, she was going to keep him as a husband. But she was afraid he would run away. So whenever she left the cave, she would roll a big boulder in front of the cave with her yaka strength. But the human Brahmin, there's no way he could move the rock, so he was trapped in there. And when she killed the merchants, and she would take their food and anything else useful that humans might want and take it back for her husband. And in time she gave birth to a son, and the three of them lived together for years in the cave until the son was starting to get a bit older, starting to grow up, and he became curious, and he asked his father, how come is it that mother doesn't look like you and I? And he says, well, she's a yaka, son. She's the head of a horse. And he said, if we're not yakas, what are we? Well, we're human beings. But the son was half yaka, so he had the yaka strength. And one day he told his father, we should just run away from here, go to the land of humans. And the father said, well, we can't get out of the cave. She always locks us in. He says, oh, I can move the boulder. And he rolled the boulder aside, and the two of them ran as fast as they could to escape. But the yakini, the horse-headed female yaka, caught them and dragged them back to the cave and scolded them severely. And they were then afraid of running away again. But the son tricked the mother one day. He said he knew the yaka lore that she must have a territory and fixed boundaries. And he said, if we can figure out where the boundaries are, then maybe we could escape across them. And he asked the mother one day, he said, surely, mother, you have a territory of your own, and as I am your offspring, one day I will inherit this territory. I should know what it is. And she told him, well, it runs from the river in the west to the hills in the north, to the forest in the east, and to another range of hills in the south. So the river was the closest boundary. So they made another attempt at escape, and they ran, and this time they got halfway across the river, and the horse-headed female yaka stopped on the riverbank. She couldn't go any further. She couldn't cross the river, and she pleaded with them to come back. She says, I love you. You're my husband and my son. Please come back. Don't leave me bereft. And they said, we're sorry, but we wish to live in the land of humans. And she said, well, if your mind is made up, it'll break my heart, but if you must go, I don't want to see my son destitute in the land of humans. He'll need some way to make a living, so I'll teach him a magic spell. This magic spell will allow him to see the footsteps of people who have passed, even 7 years since. And she told him the words of this magic spell, a manta, or a mantra, that he could recite that would make old footsteps appear to him. And she made him repeat it. She made sure that he knew it. And then she let them go on their way. And she said, now that you're leaving, my heart is breaking. And she hit herself in the chest and fell down dead. And the two of them stood on the bank and they looked and they saw she was truly dead. So they crossed back again and cremated her body with due honors. And did a ceremony and cremated her. And then they went to journey to the city of Varanasi, a rich, famous city in India. And when the son came of age and became a man, he paid leave to his father, paid respects to his father, and set out to make his own living in the world. And he went to the palace of the king, and he told the king's chamberlain that he has this great ability of tracing footsteps even 7 years in the past. And perhaps there'd be some use for me in the palace. perhaps I could help to catch thieves, for example. So they took him for an interview with the king, and the king said, "What do you want to work for me?" He said, "I want 1,000 kahapanas a day." It's an enormous sum of money. And the uh, the king said, "All right, if you have these magic powers, I shall grant you my service and a salary of 1,000 kahapanas a day." So after a few days, one of the Brahmins in the king's service became suspicious, and he said to the king, "This young man, he may be just a charlatan. We should put him to the test. We're spending a lot of money on him, and we don't know that he has actually can do these things he claims." So the king said, "That's a good idea." So the king waited until the night time when everyone was asleep, and he went into the audience hall, and he took a valuable jewel out of the throne. He pried it loose. Then he walked out of the palace, and he walked 3 times around the palace. Then he got a ladder and climbed over the palace wall. Then he walked about in the town here and there. Then he returned to the palace, climbed back over the wall, and went to the water tank and climbed up onto the top of the water tank and threw the jewel in. Then the next day in the morning, one of the guards set up an uproar. "A valuable jewel is missing from the throne. There's been a thief in the palace." And all the palace was in an uproar. They called this young fellow to see if he could track the thief. And the man said, "Surely I can recover the jewel, no problem." He walked 3 times around the palace, and he walked to the wall, and he said, "There are footsteps here in the air. He must have used a ladder. Bring me a ladder." And he climbed over the wall, and he followed around the town here and there, and then back to the palace, then to the water tank. And he said, "The jewel must be in the bottom of the water tank." And they sent someone down in to recover it. And all the crowd of people and courtiers, they snapped their fingers and waved cloths in the air. This was a common way in ancient India, apparently, of like applause, snapping of fingers and waving of cloth. So the king was delighted. He saw this boy had potential, and he said, the king said, "All right, now that you have recovered the jewel, we must find the thief and have his head cut off." And the young man knew it was the king who had done it. He thought, "This king is being very foolish." And he said, "Your Majesty, you have the jewel back. What need for you to chase down the thief?" He says, "We must set an example. No one can get away with this, no matter how well placed he is." And the man said, "Well, perhaps can I tell you a story of the ancient past that may change your mind?" He said, "In this very city of Varanasi, one time there was a musician, and he was very skilled playing the lute. One day he did a performance in the square, and he made a lot of money, and he spent it on strong drink. And he was sitting by the river, and he was well into his cups, and he decided that it would be nice to have a bath in the river. He jumped in the river with his lute, and the water flowed into the holes of the lute and dragged him down and drowned him. Now, Your Majesty, water is considered to be a beneficial thing, a refuge for beings, a helpful thing to drink and to wash and many other purposes. But here, it has turned to the person's destruction. Just as a king is a beneficial guardian of the kingdom. The king didn't take the hint, and he said, "Enough of these stories. I want to find that thief." "Oh, well, let me give you another example, Your Majesty. At one time there was a potter in this town who was digging clay to make his pots, and he dug so deep that the wall of the hole collapsed in on him and crushed him and killed him. Now, clay is considered to be a very useful thing, a beneficial thing. useful for many purposes. But here it turned to the man's destruction. Just as a king is a useful and beneficial thing for the people. Well, I don't see the point of this. When are you going to find the thief? He goes, well, let me tell you another story. He says, once there was a man whose house was burning down, and he ran inside to try and recover his treasure, and he got trapped by a falling timber and burned to death. Now, fire is a useful thing for cooking, for disposing of rubbish, for warming oneself, for many purposes. But here it turned to a man's destruction. Just as a king is a useful thing in the kingdom. Now, the king still was impatient and wanted to find the thief. So the young man kept trying. He said, there was once a man who was blown down in a windstorm and broke his neck. And just as the wind is a wonderful thing in the hot weather, but here it turned to destruction. Just as a king is a useful thing in the kingdom. The king still wouldn't be convinced. He kept going on with more stories. He told about birds in a tree, that the tree caught fire and burnt them up. The tree was their refuge and their home, and usually a wonderful thing, but here it became the source of their destruction. Then he told a story about a couple here in this town of Varanasi long ago that lived together when they were newlywed. They lived with at the husband's house with his mother. And after some time, they brought her mother over to stay as well. I should say this is a trope that often appears in these old Indian stories, is difficulties with in-laws. It's a theme that comes up again and again in these stories. The wife took to quarreling with her mother-in-law, and she told her husband, I can't stand to live with your mother any longer. We must get rid of her. So they cooked up a plan. They made up a plan, and they put a draft of sleeping potion in her evening toddy. And when she was good and unconscious, they dragged her down to the river and threw her in, and the crocodiles ate her up. And then the husband said, well, we've gotten rid of my mother. We might as well get rid of yours too. She's also kind of troublesome. So they made up another plan to deal with this other old woman. They gave her a sleeping draught, and then they carried her in her bed to the burning ground, to the charnel ground, and they laid her out on a pyre of wood, and they were going to light the wood. And the wife says, well, light the wood, husband. And he says to her, well, I didn't bring the tinder box. I thought you had it. No, I thought you were bringing it. So they went back to their house to get the materials for making the fire. And in the meantime, the old lady woke up. She was clever, and she quickly figured out what was going on. So she dragged over another corpse in the charnel ground and put it in the bed and covered it over and ran away. And the couple came back and burned up this cadaver. And meanwhile, the old woman found a cave to hide in while she figured out what to do. And it turned out it was a abandoned robber's cave, and there was a good pile of jewels and treasure there. So she adorned herself with jewels and gems, and then she returned to her family's home, and her daughter-in-law was there, and she was shocked to see the mother-in-law, who she thought was dead. She says, I thought you were dead. We burned you up. And where did you get all those wonderful jewels? And the mother-in-law says, well, this is what happens when someone's burned alive. The gods take them to heaven and give them many jewels and send them back. So the daughter-in-law, being a greedy person, ran off to charnel ground and made a pyre and threw herself on it. so, having told this long story, the man says to the king, "Do you see, king, that uh, mother should be a source of protection and refuge, and daughter should be someone loving and caring. But here the family turned against each other and came to their destruction, just as a king is beloved by his people, but he must be careful." The king still wouldn't listen, so the man finally gave up, and he said, "Well, there's nothing for it. I tried my best. Now I have to reveal the truth." And he followed the king's footsteps to the throne and said, "Here stood the thief," and the thief was indeed the king himself. And all the people crowding around watching this were so upset with the king and his foolish ways that they deposed him from the throne and cut off his head, and they made the young man the new king. So that was the story, and at the end, the Buddha said that uh, the father of the boy was Kassapa, and the Buddha was himself, and in that time he was the boy with the power of knowing footsteps. So that's the tale of the footstep Jataka.